My name is Steve Channinson. I'm a professor at Villanova University Charles Widger School of Law and one of the managing editors of the Federal Sentencing Reporter. Welcome to another session in the Center for Justice and Human Dignity's exploration of the role of the U.S. Sentencing Commission in decarceration, First Step Act and beyond. In a series of discussions about federal sentencing, it might seem odd at first blush to devote a full panel to sentencing developments in the states. But just a moment's reflection allows us to understand the importance of what's happening outside of the federal bubble. The federal courts handle only a small slice of all criminal cases. So why wouldn't we want to look beyond the US sentencing guidelines for ideas and inspiration? After all, the states are often referred to as laboratories of democracy. That concept is usually attributed to Justice Brandeis's famous 1932 dissenting opinion in New State Ice versus Liebman. He wrote, "It is one of the happy incidents of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel, social, and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country." Today's panel demonstrates how at least 3 of those state laboratories have been working overtime, innovating and trying to improve their corners of the American criminal justice system. Moderated by the Center for Justice and Human Dignity's Director of Release Reform Initiatives, Caitlin Flood, the fascinating video you're about to watch includes commission leaders from 3 states. Minnesota, the North Star state and home to the first operational set of state sentencing guidelines, is represented by its chair and former executive director, Kelly Mitchell. From the Buckeye State of Ohio, we have Executive Director Sara Andrews, and finally from the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, we have Executive Director Mark Bergstrom. I had the privilege of serving on that commission for many years, including my last few as chair. Each commission takes its responsibilities seriously. Pennsylvania's statutory mission, which in broad strokes can easily apply to all, is to carry out an effective, humane, and rational sentencing, resentencing, and parole policy. Together, the experts from whom you are about to hear will provide a guided tour of some of the recent developments in these jurisdictions, ranging from a re-examination focused on criminal history in Minnesota, to seeking data standardization in Ohio, to a comprehensive review in Pennsylvania, largely akin to what the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code sentencing now recommends. Importantly, they all look for ways to partner with academics and others, including their legislatures. They also consider, to varying degrees, correctional capacity or correctional population predictions. Finally, listen for how they try to communicate alternatives to incarceration to the judges and other actors in the courtroom. All of the points raised and activities described here will be vital food for thought for the U.S. Sentencing Commission as, we hope, it prepares to welcome a new slate of Senate-confirmed commissioners at some point in 2022. Enjoy.
Hello to our esteemed speakers, and thank you for being here today. We're really fortunate to have such creative and collaborative leaders in the State Sentencing Commission field and are grateful for your time. While acknowledging that the role and reach of individual state sentencing commissions are distinct from the United States Sentencing Commission, we're excited to learn more today about the innovations that your commissions have led and hear your thoughts on how your work might inform and relate to next steps for the Federal Sentencing Commission. So we'll just jump right in. And to start, we'd ask you all to share some initiatives that your Sentencing Commission has undertaken to advance more equitable sentencing practices and how that work might inform recommendations you may have about a broader review of sentencing guidelines. And if it's all right, maybe we'll start with you, Mark.
Sure. Well, hello, and thank you for the invitation. Regarding reforms, our commission started a process back in 2014 to do a comprehensive review of our guidelines. We've had guidelines since 1982, and we only did one previous comprehensive review. So in 2014, we impaneled about 40 or 50 people to think through the guidelines. If you're going to do it all over again, what would it look like? And effectively, we did a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And based on that, we came up with some recommendations that we then wanted to test with other people in the system. And one of the groups that we did actually at the end of the process, just in the last couple of years, is an academic review panel where we brought in individuals from different disciplines, both from Pennsylvania universities, but also nationally, to try to look at what we were coming up with and trying to make any final recommendations. And two takeaways from that effort were really important. One was there was real focus on race and ethnicity, which we'd not done a great job of in the past. And so that was a focal point. And because that was a focal point, one of the key areas that we looked at was criminal history, because that's something the commission can handle and control. And it's something where we saw disparity. And so the other part of that process that I just point out that was really important was that we took advantage of the work of the Model Penal Code Sentencing, the ALI project, because there are a lot of recommendations in there specifically to sentencing commissions and sentencing guidelines. And we found that to be really helpful in the review that we did.
Great, thank you so much. And Sara, maybe we'll turn to you next.
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Ohio is in the midst of really rethinking where we've come in the 25 years since truth in sentencing statutory scheme was enacted. And what we've realized and have admitted is that we are in a state of sheer complexity when it comes to the statutory framework. And it's that recognition that led us to our effort to develop a uniform sentencing entry for felony sentencing. And the reason that's important is because it will give judges and practitioners the ability to impose lawful sentences and have everything they need to know at their fingertips. And kind of we overuse the term living document, but it's regularly and routinely updated with changes in case law or criminal statute. And by having that uniform sentencing entry and all the courts that adopt it speaking the same language, that leads us then to, for the first time in our state, begin to talk about sentencing data in an aggregate way. So we'll be able to know where someone goes when they leave court from wherever they are within our state, which seems, to most people, well, what do you mean you don't know that already? But we really don't. And so our effort to implement the uniform sentencing entry and companion method of conviction forms, as well as what we're calling good civics forms, which those forms are kind of the best practices. So things that make a lot of sense, but maybe aren't statutorily required. And in this process, we've really taken the approach that we're resisting that traditional top-down mandate. And instead, we've used a deliberate kind of iterative approach to demonstrate the value of that uniform sentencing entry for judges and courts. In essence, giving them the opportunity to reduce those, what we have one judge that calls unforced errors in sentencing. And then at the same time, it's giving us that ability to capture that statewide information. We committed ourselves to ground rules, which I think are important, especially in a complex kind of interesting state such as ours. We're integrating the templates with the existing processes of courts because we didn't want to add administrative burden or more cost. Again, using that incremental and slow-paced process. And also we have a pretty complex and inclusive governance structure. So what we have learned and what I think the guiding principle is here is that telling the story of sentencing is important. It's not just a data point, that the nuances matter. And our approach has really helped inspire the engagement of courts and judges and everyone participating in the effort.
Thank you so much. And I think a common theme I'm hearing from both you and Mark is really an opportunity to do a full review and being open to the feedback that comes out of that review and being willing to kind of go back to the drawing board and rethink kind of first principles. So that's great. And we'll turn to you, Kelly.
I think I'm going to be a little bit more of the same. just the Pennsylvania did the full guidelines review, and what Minnesota has done more recently is just a review of the criminal history score itself, a comprehensive review of that. The score has been in place for 40 years. It hasn't received a major overhaul during that time. And so the commission thought it was really important to take a fresh look at it, not assume that just because it's always been that way, that it's good for it to be that way. Our commission by law is required to consider public safety as its primary goal. So when the commission reviewed the criminal history score, we were looking at how well does it predict recidivism, and how well does it do that? So we partnered with the Rabina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice, and they did a study. They actually broke down the score by component to figure out, does the whole score predict recidivism? Does each component predict recidivism? Is it doing the job that we hope it's doing? And we found a couple of things out. Number one, the juvenile point. So whether or not a prior juvenile offense is included in criminal history actually was not predictive of recidivism at all, the way that we were using it. And it was one of the sources of racial disparity in our criminal history score. Number two, custody status, which just tells us whether or not that person was on probation or parole at the time that they committed the offense, was also not predictive of recidivism. It was only identifying 1 out of 100 recidivists. And it was contributing to racial disparity, and it was also outweighing the value of the prior offense in our criminal history score. So the commission decided to act on the custody status point and tried to downweight that and give it less weight in the score. It turns out the commission didn't do a great job. We actually sort of messed it up, and it's not working in the field right now. So we're still working on it. And actually now we're going further with our thinking, and we're actually having discussions about, do we need to be tracking custody status at all? I mean, of all the components that are in our criminal history score, it's the only one that doesn't directly measure prior offending. And so we're trying to think about, on a philosophical level, what purpose does it serve? Is it actually, fair? Or is it serving as a point of double punishment for folks? So more to come on that one, but just sort of a demonstration of how it's an ever-evolving process.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. And actually, I think that's a really good segue into our next question, because you're hitting on a few different points around the importance of looking at the numbers, looking at the data to inform next steps. So we would love to hear a little bit more about what your commissions are doing and what you're learning about data collection, analysis, and the partnerships that have allowed changes based on that data collection. And what are some of the ways you might recommend that the United States Sentencing Commission can build on its use of data review?
Well, I can start by just sort of echoing some of what Kelly and Sara said, but clearly the Pennsylvania Commission has had an affiliation with Penn State through the criminology department since the 80s. And so we work very closely with faculty and grad students, postdocs, and others in just about every project we undertake. But data is just the coin of the realm, and it's really important both that it be accurate and complete. And part of that involves partnerships. So trying to look at other sources of data, that can confirm what you have, or help to refine what you have, or expand the scope. Health data, things like that can be really helpful, census data and so forth. So it's really important to build relationships. And some of those relationships can be with other sentencing commissions, including the United States Sentencing Commission. I think there's great opportunities to try to look for ways to share information, because the people we deal with don't necessarily just remain in Pennsylvania. And so having information on activities in other states and penalties in other states or other jurisdictions can be really helpful. We also partner with other universities outside of Penn State. And where we found that was particularly helpful was to something Kelly was talking about, which is, criminal history writ large, because There may be a role for retribution as part of criminal history, but I think the focal point for most of us is risk. It's public safety. And so we look at sort of both of those dimensions, the difference between no criminal history and any criminal history as perhaps a retributive kind of factor in thinking about criminal history. But then more importantly, when you're looking at risk itself, trying to really tear apart the criminal history and try to figure out what is meaningful and helpful. And Kelly's point about juvenile adjudications and the role of that and other factors make a lot of sense and are really important. So our partnerships and the focus on the quality of data is good. The final thing I'll say about those research partnerships is that it helps to bring sort of the academy to the field, because these large research institutions are at the cutting edge of ways of analyzing data that can be really helpful, especially in weeding out things like disproportionality and so forth. So we really benefit from the relationship with people that are in the field and working with new approaches to conducting research. And what helps in research partnerships is we each bring something to the table. So we might bring data, we might bring sort of applied research, we might bring connections to individuals to the table. And what the academy brings is just that strong sort of scientific approach and the skills to really conduct high-level analysis. Thanks.
Well, I can follow up with that. Though unlike Pennsylvania, the Ohio Criminal Sentencing Commission anyway, can't bring data to the table. But we have capitalized on the many universities and academic partnerships that we have developed in our state. And that's because we're all interested in the same goal, in capturing information and being able to talk about what's happening in our state. And we understand that the data collection is just one piece of the solution to the larger problem of those disparate, non-standardized sentencing information. And so we've developed a couple different strategies that will help us get to the point of talking more about what information we will be able to collect. And so we are, it's a strategy to collate, display, share, and utilize the data collected. So in other words, we're talking about and working with our partners, not only academics, but others, to develop and evaluate a public portal for sentencing data. Because without a way for the courts and the public to learn about and utilize that sentencing information, collecting it's merely an exercise. So if people don't know what they're looking at, I don't think it matters. And the other piece, the other strategy that we think, and again, I think we're a little farther behind than some, but the felony offense code is really, as we all know, the linchpin of the system, right? So without the ability to aggregate that detailed criminal information by offense code, analyzing system-wide data is impossible. So we have created a partnership with the Legislative Services Commission here and the Ohio Judicial Conference and other partners, but we're creating a standardized, centralized Ohio Criminal Offense Code application. And it'll be non-proprietary, and the application will provide an interface to add and update standardized felony offense codes for every agency within our state that wants to use it. And I think that will really get us to a point where we can talk more like Kelly and Mark do about, oh, we're analyzing criminal history information, or we're analyzing this, or we have data sets to provide. I guess the takeaway for us is rethinking and developing creative, as you said in the beginning, strategies to accomplish goals that matter to people and giving them the information that's important to them.
Right. I have another point to add here, if that's, I think it's really important to emphasize how important having really good data about sentencing is to controlling prison populations. Most sentencing commissions also have a function because they track data, because they are able to predict, sentencing patterns. They can also understand, they can also create fiscal notes for the legislature to help them understand for any, criminal offense that the legislature is proposing to create or amend, what's going to be the prison bed impact of that. And that relationship that our commission has with the Minnesota legislature has been key to keeping the prison population down in Minnesota, and also, key to making the legislature accountable for the changes that it makes to criminal laws, right? If they come up with a bill that takes up too many prison beds, because legislatures at the state level have to balance their budgets, they're going to have to either find a way to reduce beds somewhere else so they can pay for that law that they've brought forth, or they're going to have to agree to pay for it by increasing the prison capacity. At the federal level, the federal level has the ability to carry a deficit, so maybe that pressure isn't there in the same way, but they could start thinking about prison population itself as their benchmark, right? And have information from the Sentencing Commission predicting increases and decreases in prison population based on those changes in laws. And they could set guidelines for themselves and not be able to go over a particular number that they set as their cap. I mean, that's how I think they could learn from the states and how we've been able to control our populations using this information in that way.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that point up, Kelly, too, because it gets at kind of the value of a cost benefit analysis, not only for our current practices and looking at cost benefit analysis for folks in custody, but also looking at the benefit side of, if we're looking at what are the costs and the benefits of doing alternative to incarceration programs, what resources need to be put towards that. And I know an earlier panel of ours is addressing alternative to incarceration options and how judges can expand their use. But I think having those initial numbers and being able to say, this is how we know what it costs us based on the number of beds, and having that kind of population count available, that's a really helpful point. So as we're thinking through kind of longer term, more sustainable changes to sentencing law, we would love for you all to speak to either the formal or informal influences that your commissions have on legislative decision-making related to sentencing. And maybe we'll start with you, Mark.
Sure. Well, I want to pick up on Kelly's point, because I think that's one example of that. There are formal ways of communicating information to a legislature or to an executive branch or to the courts. And impact analysis is one of those that can be very formal and can be in response to questions, but it can also be used informally to drive decisions. The Pennsylvania Commission is actually a legislative agency. So although we're fairly autonomous, we are at least on that team, and as a result of that, we spend a lot of time informally meeting with or discussing with staff or with members, a sponsor of a bill, things like that. The language to be used in the bill to target the intent of the bill. We also look at the impact, as Kelly said, in terms of what would be the impact based on the draft as written, and how can we narrow that or focus that. We're also really interested in sort of what works. I mean, at the end of the day, we just want better outcomes. And I think our General Assembly wants better outcomes. Everyone wants better outcomes. So the more you can do to determine what works and what doesn't, or in what kind of capacity. It may be an outcome measure, as Kelly said, in terms of, incarceration or confinement levels, but it might also just be benchmarking recidivism rates and trying to find the best fit for that type of offender, or that type of offense. And so I think, the more and better information you have, the better you can do that. But it's often done in a very formal way. And sometimes, at least we've found that formal can be too late in the process. And so having relationships where you're spending a lot of time at the sort of the early stages of legislation or program development or things like that provides a really good opportunity to insert information based on research and based on data that can help inform that process and maybe, you know, as Sara was saying, avoid unforced errors, but also really promote better practices and narrower, more targeted legislation.
Yeah, and I'd like to add too, we would like to be more proactive in the process, and we have worked with legislators and of course have them on the commission, and we've had task forces and ad hoc committees that have made recommendations for legislative change, some of which have been picked up and introduced. And there are currently some bills pending now on juvenile bindover and bail and pretrial services. Record sealing is kind of a perpetual topic. But as Kelly mentioned, and Mark did too, the legislature understanding and being given information on the implementation of those changes is key. And just recently, our commission has been tasked with studying the impact of legislation that is considered to be criminal justice or sentencing related reform efforts. And so I feel like for the first time, there's a designated responsible group to say, what was the change? What was the intention? What is the outcome? And you know, we've gone farther to say, what do we need to know? What do we want to know? What don't we have the ability to know? And really talk about also unintended consequences, because at least for our state and our commission, the way we've looked at it is the way we've gotten to this overly burdensome, complex system and sentencing structure is that we haven't stepped back when changes are made to say, how was it implemented and what did it change, and should we reconsider or reevaluate? Yeah, there may be some cleanup, but let's talk about the systemic impact of those changes. And you know, we just issued our report from the House Bill 1 impact study. We were required to study it. It was changed last General Assembly. And, you know, frankly, it just confirmed what we already know, that the information and data surrounding topics like record sealing, intervention in lieu of conviction or diversion options are really, the information is either limited, not existent, or disparate and disconnected. And so we end up trying to piece together a story with limited resources. But at the same time, I think that helps us understand why the opportunity to provide better and connected sources of information is so important, because the anecdotal information just doesn't give people what they want to know about outcomes and how things have impacted not only practitioners, but the people moving through the system.
I'd say for Minnesota, sentencing policy is really a push and pull between the legislature and the Sentencing Commission. I'll give one example. For a long time, Minnesota had one of the harshest set of drug sentencing laws on the books. It took very small amounts of drugs to result in a very high charge. All drug offenses were felonies. There really were no non-felony level drug offenses. What was going on is that this topic was kind of going back and forth between the legislature. The Sentencing Commission noticed that although we had sentencing that was in line with the laws that were on the books, right? We had to set the guidelines similar to the way the laws were written on the books. There were really high departure rates across the state. It's pretty rare in Minnesota for the whole state to disagree with the policy, but this was one where it actually came through in sentencing across the state. And we had departure rates that were sometimes 50% mitigated departures for, especially for first-time offenders coming in with maybe a first-degree drug possession charge. And so, you know, we tried to inform the legislature about this, because really at the end of the day, the problem was with the way the statutes were drafted. The guidelines were kind of, developed in suits based on how the statutes were drafted. So we tried to inform the legislature. We tried to bring it to their attention. We tried to get engagement from the legislature. Sometimes the legislature would, be interested, but maybe they kick it back to us for a letter telling us to make a formal recommendation. But, at the end of the day, it just volleyed back and forth for years and nobody was doing anything. And then finally, the commission said, well, okay, but we can actually do something here. Right now, the sentences on our grid are pretty much in line with the statutes, but we can lower them on our own. We can take sentencing practice and we can lower the presumptive sentence. So the commission created a drug grid. We reset all of the offenses on that drug grid. We brought sentencing down more in line with the way that it was actually being played out in the field. And then we submitted that to the legislature for their consideration. And once we did that, man, all bets were off. The legislature did not like it. They wanted control of this topic, and they were forced that session to finally address the drug laws. They actually changed the amounts that would trigger particular offenses. They reduced some of those felony possession crimes down to gross misdemeanor levels, taking it off the sentencing guidelines grid altogether. And then they actually allowed us to keep the grid in place. They asked us to make some tweaks to it, but for the most part, they didn't change it, too terribly much. So that was one of those situations where that, we went back and forth for quite a long time, but then in the end, one of us had to pull the trigger. And once we did as a commission, that really forced the change of the legislature, and it was a, pretty good outcome all the way around.
Thanks so much for sharing that and explaining a little bit more about kind of the interplay between the legislature and your individual commissions. And so, we know that one of the many functions of sentencing commissions is making amendments and introducing some changes. But as has been mentioned, some of those changes are based on maybe limited data or competing interests and priorities from the different stakeholders and groups that you all are working with. And we certainly appreciate all of your collective humility, kind of in acknowledging that sometimes amendments to the amendments might be needed. So we're hoping if anyone wanted to address, how your commissions have made different course corrections over time, either in actual sentencing guidelines or some of the guidance that your commissions are sharing, and how those changes have kind of been messaged to the community, and to folks that might not understand all the nitty-gritty about sentencing schemes, but the value of course correction and how that's kind of played out in your roles.
Sure, I can start. In terms of a couple of course corrections, I think of like big course corrections, like when we do comprehensive reviews. And back in the 90s, when we did our first comprehensive review of the guidelines, I think we were right sizing our penalties. We sort of benchmarked against other jurisdictions like Minnesota and other sentencing guideline states. But we also looked at what our General Assembly was doing in our executive branch in terms of legislation. And at that time, what we realized was we had to increase penalties for serious and violent offenders. And then on the other side, for drug offenses, we were probably pretty high and we needed to reduce some of those. But in particular, we needed to have a structure by which we could provide clinical treatment in lieu of incarceration and build that into the structure of our guidelines. And so that's always been a big area, that kind of balancing and also that ability to take an existing recommendation and maybe provide an alternative or a reduction. And the most recent example of that was with fentanyl. We had in the western part of our state, in the Pittsburgh area, a number of years ago, we had a big spike in fentanyl deaths. And we were watching fentanyl move sort of west to east across the state. And there was a real interest in trying to address fentanyl as sort of a new and different drug and enhance penalties for it. And we did that at the request of prosecutors and others. At some point, we realized that the lowest category of fentanyl, we may have done the right job in terms of the recommendation for many cases, but we also, in effect, restricted many of those people from treatment. And so we reduced our assignment for that one low category of fentanyl to give courts greater discretion in using treatment in lieu of incarceration for many of those kind of cases. So it was a sort of redirection in a micro way, even though most redirection we do is at a macro level.
I'm happy to jump in with something a little more technical. We have a decay policy in our criminal history score, and what that means is that at some point a prior conviction no longer counts for criminal history. And we've been swimming along just fine with that for a long time. It looks like it looks very fair on its face. And suddenly we realized that it was actually being applied differently to people who had prior prison sentences versus prior probation sentences. And this is due to another quirk in Minnesota. At the time, our average prison sentence was about 4 years, but the average probation length was about 7 years. So our decay policy was saying that offense would come off your record 15 years after discharge from your sentence. And because the average probation term was longer, it was actually staying on the record for somebody who committed a less serious crime longer than for someone who had served time in prison. And that didn't make any sense at all. So that was definitely a place where we needed course correction, but we wouldn't have realized it if we hadn't been looking at how the policies were actually applied rather than how they read on paper. So we did eventually change that so that if your prior was a prison sentence, the decay period starts as soon as you're discharged from that sentence. But if the prior was a probation sentence, the decay period starts right at the time of sentencing, so that all the time that you're out in the community on your sentence also counts during that decay period.
Great, thank you for sharing those examples. And I think, also an important reminder that, while changes are needed, it's also about looking at, okay, what are the outcomes of those changes that we're seeing on the ground? Because as you all have noted, it's very different to have a policy in place or an amendment that's proposed and actually implementing those changes. And so then our next question is, in line with kind of changing some of the current defaults or presumptions in the federal sentencing space, I'm wondering if you could speak to how proposed amendments are reviewed by the legislature, or if there are other tangible ways that your commission has embedded alternative sentencing into materials and resources for decision makers. And Kelly, I think I'm going to direct this question to you first, because I know during prep you had some interesting ideas about what Minnesota is doing.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. I mean, all sentencing commissions work on a delegation of authority from the legislature. So they can't act without the legislature being involved at some level. But there's really a difference in, does the legislature have to actively approve the work of the commission, or can it serve as more of a veto power? And in Minnesota, it's definitely the veto power that we have. So the commission will work on its big policy changes on an annual schedule. We'll go through our public hearing process. We'll finalize what changes we want to make, and then we report those to the legislature each year in January. And then the legislature has one legislative session to review our changes. And if they are not happy with the way something happened, they have to pass a law to change it. They might pass a law to, stop the change from going into effect, or maybe just to redirect our work a little bit, have us tweak. One time when we created a new grid, they had us, tweak a couple of the numbers on the top cell, on the top row of that grid, so the law will say that. But if they do nothing, then then our changes automatically go into effect in August of that year. And I think that's a good balance. It really allows the legislature to not get too concerned with our work if it's not concerning them, but it also gives them the opportunity to weigh in and exercise their oversight role if our work is concerning them. And I did want to say that one of the really important things about the way that we present our sentencing guidelines out to the world is really the visual representation of our policy. The grid is really the visual representation of our policies. And so, Minnesota is a state that really values community supervision as a sentence, and we actually think that that's appropriate for a majority of our cases. And so our grids have a big, wide, lightly shaded section that shows where we think presumptive probation is appropriate and where we think prison is appropriate for those more serious offenses at the top of the grid. I look at some other grids that are out there. And Kansas is another good example. They've got order boxes. So those are cells that sort of tell the court, all right, this is a space where both prison or probation might be appropriate. You choose. But, on below that or above that, it's probably probation or prison. The US sentencing grid, in contrast, I know that there's probation available somewhere in there, but I can't see it on their grid. And I wish I could, because I actually didn't know there was any probation until I took the time to read the very long set of guidelines. But I think they could really communicate to the court, to the criminal justice system, those places where they do think that alternatives to prison would be appropriate by just placing it right on the grid with another shade or some little notation to indicate that, hey, prison doesn't have to be the only option in every cell.
Just to pick up on that, two quick observations. One, the Pennsylvania Commission received a mandate to create probation guidelines separate from our others. And so we, in our last amendment, built in separate cells, as Kelly was saying, for probation recommendations. And in this comprehensive review, we are building a level of the guidelines just for probation so that we can really, as Kelly said, give it greater visibility and prominence and really thoughtful consideration of when probation should be used. But separate from that, the Commission also had a mandate to create a risk assessment instrument for use at sentencing. And there were a lot of concerns about this. In fact, I remember meeting with the United States Sentencing Commission talking about the work we were doing on that. In the end, what our commission developed as part of this risk assessment instrument was an effort to just identify outlier cases for which more and better information should be considered by the court at sentencing. So at the lower end, if you think low risk cases, really opportunities for diversion, and certainly before the date of sentencing, that earlier in the system, that's part of the consideration. But for those higher risk cases, there's a lot of reasons someone's high risk. It could be mental health, it could be drug dependency, it could be a lot of other things. And at least in state courts or in our state court, there's the quality of the information is pretty weak. At least, there's not consistently good information. And I think the idea of targeting cases to identify those as cases where special considerations, slowing down the case, those kind of things can be helpful. And in that space, what we found is information on risk, needs, and responsivity is really helpful to provide the court with a broader and deeper recommendation about what might be an appropriate sentence for that individual. So these are ways, as Caitlin said, of sort of embedding alternatives in the information provided to decision makers.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so our final question, so besides providing guidance to judges on individual sentencing decisions, all of your commissions also play a role in analyzing the impact of different policy changes at a more systemic level. And so we're wondering if you could speak about the role of commissions towards advancing more informed, data-driven decisions, both at the policy and judicial level, and maybe specifically noting, if you'd like, the use of racial impact statements and other assessments related to changes in sentencing laws.
Well, first, I want to point out Kelly should be talking about the racial impact statements because I think Minnesota has really been the leader in that. But I think at a sort of a policy level, the kind of analysis we've been doing is really focused on those sort of structural ways in which we embed race and ethnicity, other things like that, into sentencing practices. And so that's why this review that we're doing, an important aspect of that was bringing in this academic review panel to try to make sure that we're not just building racial disproportionality into our guidelines, that we're sensitively thinking about those kind of things and trying to address it. But I think the comment I just made about risk assessments and information like that to inform sentencing, that also addresses at an individual level some of those same concerns about race, ethnicity, and disproportionality.
So I feel like I should say at least something. I think Ohio is the outlier here. We're not really a guideline state. And so we don't have the opportunity to do those hard and fast kind of examples and reviews of specific guidelines. But we are taking a look at the sentencing structure and trying to reevaluate how that discretion is guided. And we've empaneled a group to help us do that. And so we look forward to, in the next year, really kind of, like I said before, rethinking the 25 years of where we started with truth in sentencing and where are we now. And by and large, we all agree truth in sentencing is kind of a misnomer anymore. But it is important that we continue to have those conversations. So we look to Pennsylvania and Minnesota as kind of our leaders and guidance, and other states as well. I think for us, it's important to have that baseline and give the courts and judges, here's how the sentencing structure is laid out and what you need to do to impose that sentence. If we can get that far, then maybe down the road, Ohio will be able to talk about, more direct impact and having better information at that granular level. Right now, we just need the general aggregate information.
And I can talk to the racial impact. So Minnesota started providing racial impact statements in about 2008. We now call them demographic impact statements because we cover race, gender, and judicial districts in our statements now. But basically, it's just like a fiscal note, except that we are focused on who's going to be impacted by this particular law or change. And so basically, we can tell if the legislature is proposing to enact a new crime, or let's say they're adding a new crime, a new version of a crime, we can tell from past sentencing patterns what the racial breakdown will be of the people that we think will be convicted of that crime, what the racial breakdown will be of those who receive a prison sentence or a probation sentence. And we send it directly to the legislature. We send it to the chair and the ranking minority member of the two committees that handle public safety issues, as well as the authors of the bills. And I can say that, I've seen that the effect. There was one case in Minnesota, or one incident in Minnesota where we had a particularly awful incident where a 13-year-old committed murder. Under Minnesota law, that 13-year-old is handled in the juvenile delinquency system. They're not eligible to be tried as an adult. And so there, of course, the response was to bring a bill to lower the age of transferring the juvenile to adult status down to 13. So we did the demographic impact on that particular law change. And we were able to say that if it went into effect, every child who was convicted under that law would be Black in Minnesota. And that was really compelling for the committees that heard that bill, and it did play a role in blocking passage of that bill. It ultimately didn't pass. It's a terrible situation, but it was a time where the legislature really actually thought it was very important to think through the racial implications of their decisions as well. So that's the kind of discussion that we hope to get going when we provide that information to the legislature.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Mark, Sarah, and Kelly. This has been an extremely fruitful conversation. And we're really interested in how the lessons learned, both at the state and federal sentencing level, can be shared and used to improve sentencing practices and equity moving forward. So we'll pause here for now so that we have some time for questions from the audience. Awesome. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. We had a really great number of attendees in our attendee hub. So we're excited that so many of you could join us for our pre-recorded content. And then we are fortunate enough to have our brilliant speakers and panelists joining us live today. So we were going to pose 1 or 2 questions that came into the chat. But please know that if you have any questions, follow-ups, or comments on what any of our 3 speakers shared with us today, you are more than welcome to put that in the Q&A or the chat on the right side of your attendee hub. So for all of our speakers, and I'm kind of just going to let you guys do popcorn, whoever can jump in like Family Feud style first. The question is, how have you balanced the need for sentencing parity or sentencing equity between various jurisdictions within your states and judicial discretion for unique considerations in each case? So really kind of circling back to some of the things we were addressing between this balance between uniformity within sentencing guidelines and wanting to create equity by having some objective factors and parity between sentencing decisions, but then also acknowledging that courts and judges and prosecutors and defenders and service providers are working with individual people with individual challenges, individual strengths, and individual circumstances. So leaving that question open to anybody who might want to jump in.
Sure, I'll take a start, I guess. I guess there's 2 different approaches we've taken. I think in our earlier days and not too recent past, our commission's approach in Pennsylvania has been fairly prescriptive in that we have policy considerations in terms of the purpose of sentencing and other things like that that might guide the range of options available to the court. And just like with the federal courts, in Pennsylvania, we have urban courts, we have rural courts, we have, a whole mix of things. And so you are going to see different practices. And because our courts generally operate at a county level, there are different resources available, different programs available, and so forth. So I think it's important that you have a structure that promotes uniformity and proportionality, but that you take into account the needs and abilities of courts and the discretion of the court in looking at an individual case. So I'd say in our earlier years, we were much focused on having broader discretion, wider ranges in our guidelines that, all of God's children fit into. So it probably was not as focused on uniformity, but it certainly was trying to focus on a given type of disposition and sort of a zone for the duration, but was viewed as fairly broad guidelines. What we're moving towards now is much more descriptive. We're using data over years that we can try to target what is the typical sentence for the typical offender. And so we generally use median sentences. So statewide data that's controlled for a lot of things. We look at the median sentence and we sort of assume that is the typical sentence. And we build around that in terms of identifying a single disposition that aligns with that median and a duration, a range that seems sufficient for that. And then we've spent a lot of time working with courts to articulate specific reasons for aggravation and mitigation, and also for courts to provide us with what we call contextual information on programs and services, tracks for courts, things like that might impact the nature of a sentence. So a judge sitting in a certain court that is intended to expedite cases isn't criticized because the cases coming out of there are dealt with more leniently than other cases. So those are examples of how we try to reconcile uniformity and proportionality with discretion.
That's great, Mark. And Kelly, I'm going to jump in only because I'm seeing we have another live question. So if we've got time and if folks can stay past 1 p.m., we'll circle back to that question. But I did want to make sure we got to Jeremy Travis's question. Thank you so much for sending us a note, Jeremy. So Jeremy's question is, do any of your commissions calculate racial disparities in incarceration rates? So again, Kelly and Sarah, I'm sorry to jump in, but we would be remiss, and I feel like I would be dinged a million points in the criminal justice reform world if we didn't get to Jeremy's question. So again, looking at whether state commissions are calculating racial disparities within incarceration rates.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about the racial demographic impact statement earlier during the presentation today. And, you know, in Minnesota, we actually calculate that information regularly. So it is part of our annual reports that we publish. It's part of our annual report to the legislature. Just what is the racial makeup, and we can see that, you know, there are racial disparities in the population of people that are sentenced for felony level offenses, and then that disparity gets worse when you look at what's the population that's actually sentenced to prison. But what we're trying to sort of get to the root of right now within our commission is it our policies that are resulting in that disparity? Are the guidelines making that worse? Or is it external factors? So those are really important questions to ask.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I'll just add to that. Oh, just really briefly that I think our focus more recently is to certainly look at racial composition and disparity. The two areas we've focused on is related to risk and also related to criminal history, because we find that those are the two areas, as Kelly said, where we really control the agenda. We set guidelines, and if we're structurally creating inequities, we need to address that. So when we look at risk and we look at prior record score or criminal history, those are the two areas that we're trying to develop policies that hopefully will neutralize some of those issues.
Perfect. Sarah, did you want to say something? Yeah.
I was just going to say, of course, for Ohio, we're still on the path to have information and sentencing data available. So we are not collecting it.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And then one other question that we just got a few more coming in. So the question is, I know one of the speakers mentioned how you share this data with policymakers on the federal level. Can you talk to that a bit more? Does the data that you call have any effect and application on the federal level? And not that I'm directing this question, but Mark, I know that you had spoken to this a bit in our prep, and then also about, you know, some things that you've done at the state level to allow for that two-way street, that kind of cross communication between state commissions informing USSC, what USSC can do to be supportive of state commissions. So I'll volley it over to you.
Sure. I think there's a lot more that could be done, but I think there are intersections that sort of lend themselves to sharing information and comparing what's going on. And I think about those cases, especially where you have district attorneys in a state cross-filed or badged with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And you see that around things like firearms and other types of offenses where there is really this joint effort across jurisdictions. I think those are great opportunities to think about how we can share and analyze both state data and federal data, because there is a sharing of jurisdictions. I know there are gun cases that we will cede to the feds or they will cede to the state. And that's a really interesting area to study in terms of using the data from both sides of the system to see what are the best practices. How do we get best outcomes in public safety and in outcomes with individuals?
Having some mic issues. Thank you so much, Mark. And my colleague Caitlin had to step away. Unfortunately, she was on a really tight schedule with us. I just wanted to, let's see if we had any final questions or further responses at the moment. One last question that was posed in our feed here. Are you aware of examples where the U.S. Sentencing Commission data have affected federal legislation? I think I'd be curious also if it's affected state legislation, but the question here states federal legislation. What are those? If so, if not, are there opportunities you see there?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'd say for sure. I mean, the U.S. Commission plays the same role with Congress that the state commissions play with the state legislatures. So probably the biggest example that anyone here is likely familiar with is the crack, powder, cocaine disparity at the federal level. That was there was 100-to-1 difference in the sentencing for that offense. It was partly driven by the law, partly driven by the guidelines. But the study that happened at the U.S. Sentencing Commission really drove the conversation in Congress to allow that disparity to be reduced to, I think it's 20-to-1 or 14-to-1 now. But that's an example of that interplay at the federal level, and Mark might have another example too.
Yeah, I was going to mention we have a task force in Pennsylvania looking at child pornography, abuse of children through the pornography industry, and one of the things that I was really impressed with was the work of the United States Sentencing Commission in preparing a number of reports on that, and really using their data to think in terms of their guidelines and the sentencing. In the recent confirmation hearings, there was discussion of some of the child pornography sentences and how you have this interaction between Congress and sort of legislative policies, and how the commission is trying to incorporate that into their guidelines. I think we see the same thing at the state level, but I was really impressed with the quality of the work that was done and sort of the helpful advice that the U.S. Sentencing Commission was providing to Congress through those reports.
And just to kind of follow up on that one, Minnesota had to do a review of child pornography sentencing a few years after the U.S. Sentencing Commission put those reports out, and that work was invaluable to our work in trying to understand that issue and trying to understand what factors we really needed to be considering as we were thinking about, do we have these offenses ranked in the right place, or do we need to be reconsidering those rankings or building other factors into the way that our guidelines work? So yeah, that's a great example of cross-pollination across state and federal systems.
Thank you so much. And at this point, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time and availability. You've all been incredible, shared incredible insights for all of us. I'll open it up to any further comments if there's any other interest. I will, just before we kind of wrap up, ask this group together if what you've hold on, let me go back to that question, if you'll excuse me. So one final question: how do the commissions in the states make space or codify the use of alternatives of incarceration within the various courts? And have you helped encourage that, or have you been able to do that through the guidelines?
Sure, I can start. In Pennsylvania, I think when we think about alternatives, we think at two different decision points. We think about pretrial diversions, trying to provide programming, treatment, other kind of things as an alternative to formal disposition of a case. And that's really the province of the prosecutor and others, sort of pretrial services. But within sentencing, we spent a lot of effort trying to look at the appropriate trade-off between the use of confinement and the use of community supervision, and particularly two different types of community supervision. When you're using restrictive conditions as, in effect, a trade-off to confinement, and that really gets to defining those restrictive conditions and creating whatever that value is for the trade-off, a one-to-one trade-off, day for day, something like that. So we've really built that into our sentencing guidelines to promote the use of community-based alternatives to confinement. But the other side of that is to think about treatment, and particularly clinically prescribed treatment. So especially for those individuals that you're trying to find alternatives, it's not really a day-to-day trade-off when you're talking about trying to fix an underlying problem. And so we really do focus on using clinical evaluations, clinical treatment recommendations as an alternative to a confinement sentence. So it's almost like a paradigm shift. So I think both of those are ways of codifying the use of alternatives and building them into existing structures.
And if I could speak for Mark a little bit more, the Pennsylvania guidelines are a bit unique in that there are multiple disposition types built right into the structure. You can see it on the grid, so you can see where prison is recommended, where alternatives to incarceration are recommended. That is part of the structure, whereas Minnesota has a bit of an older structure, and all we really tell you is this a prison or a non-prison sentence? So there's a lot of opportunity right in the structure of the grid for building in those considerations.
And I'll say, while Ohio isn't a guideline state per se, we're fortunate to have a pretty sophisticated community corrections system, and judges and practitioners utilize it and have any number of options available.
I think we might have. Oh, it looks like we'll have to have Sara rejoin us. I know the last question that we had posed was actually directed to Sara, so maybe we'll give it just a moment and see if she can get back on with us.
Well, I think if Sara was here, what she would say is Ohio has a more narrative structure to their laws. So they actually direct judges to be thinking about these things at the same time that they have sentencing. They don't have guidelines in the same way that Mark or I or Minnesota or Pennsylvania do, but they do sort of direct judges to think about these alternatives in a more narrative way. And I'll let Sara pick it up from there if she wants to.
You know what's ironic? I know this is totally off track, but we just got the whatever fiber optic from AT&T, and so I can't keep a connection. So I apologize. It's not all they say it is.
Well, thank you, Kelly and Sara, for stepping in on that, on helping continue that conversation. And Sara, this is a question that was posed about Ohio, but I believe we can then expand this to other spaces as well. The question is, let's see here, the local level. Okay, why don't we have better data in Ohio and across the U.S. at this point, and what can be done to improve this?
Well, when it comes to sentencing and criminal justice information in Ohio, every jurisdiction has their own information, but it's traditionally been locally kept and not standardized across those locations. And so we all can talk about our own information, but then trying to aggregate that information has been difficult because there hasn't been a standardized way to talk about sentencing or to talk about the criminal offenses in the revised code. So that's what you heard me talk about, that we've learned in developing the uniform sentencing entry, is if we have entries that speak the same language, then we can begin to then aggregate the information, because it's all going to be in the same, displayed in the same way. And I think there are a number of reasons why we don't have that information in our state. It's not that we haven't talked about it. I mean, it has been, there have been task forces and language in the revised code about collecting this kind of information for more than 30 years. It's just, I think, the combination of local control and the effort and the energy and the I guess political will, as well as just key players and champions for the effort to make it happen, because it's difficult to bring everyone to the table and get them to consensus on what should be collected, how it should be displayed, how it should be talked about. And that's what we're, marching down that road now. And thankfully, Mark has been very helpful, because we're trying, we know there are lessons to be learned. And so we're employing all the strategies we can to make people understand and appreciate the value of having information that tells us what happens when people leave court, what happens for people who don't go to prison, what are those outcomes, and how many people are convicted of a particular offense in our state at any given time or any, particular year. And it seems like it would be simple, but it's very difficult. And the complexity of our statutes contributes to that difficulty. I think that's another factor of why we don't have it already, is because the volumes of the sentencing framework are enormous, and to try to drill down and get folks to put those terms in standardized formats is difficult, because we all developed our own systems. So we're taking it slowly and working toward it. We're optimistic. I think we have it in the right place today to talk more about the story of sentencing. I think Kelly and Mark have both touched on that, you can't take a number and translate it to the people and the individuals. So we need to talk about the nuances and the details behind those numbers to really tell the story. And that's how I think that we will accomplish the goal, or kind of get over that hurdle, is really talking more about not just a number, but how did the person get to the outcome that they had for that sentence, and what was considered and why was it considered.
Hey, Rachel, on
thanks
that
to Mark
point,
and Kelly.
Yeah, I was going to say on that point, I think one of the things that helped Pennsylvania, and I think is a little bit more difficult in Ohio, is the sentencing structure and the statutes. Pennsylvania, for better or worse, back in the 70s, generally adopted the model penal code for developing their offense categories and offense descriptions, and that order, that sort of structure, I think helps us to come up at sort of a macro level with this mapping of offenses, of trying to have standards in place for offenses and grades of offenses and things like that. And if you don't have that kind of framework in place, I think it's just all the more difficult to gather information in a similar way and to sort of aggregate similar things. So I think we benefited probably from the model penal code in just the structure of our statutes, but we do have difficulty. The more you get granular, the more difficult it gets, because you want to make sure you're combining similar things, and it's hard to figure out what that is. But one of the things we've struggled with is we'd really like to do a better job on things like cost benefit analysis. And when you're looking at outcomes and you're looking at costs for programs, you're getting down to dispositions at a local level. And we have 67 counties and 67 different ways of doing things, I'm sure. And that's really difficult. So it sort of points to that issue of when things aren't organized, when there's a lot of individual discretion locally, you're going to have just a tougher time coming up with that sort of aggregate information you need to inform policy. So we're really working on trying to find crosswalks and other things that we can do to map things so that we can have better information, sort of an apples to apples comparison when we get down to what programs work and what's the cost of those programs.
Thank you. And yes, I know that this is the issue of parity in data measurements is something we've heard a lot about within various systems throughout the country. I don't know, Kelly, if you had any other thoughts as far as Minnesota and their data, or?
No, I mean, Minnesota has just always been committed to data. One of the employees that works for our commission, who's been there almost since the beginning, can still remember when she received data on tapes, like on metal, like, I don't know. So she would go to some location, pick up a tape, come back, and then, they'd have to like start to hand code information. Some states have done it on paper, right? Like, so it's really, I think Sara made a good point that commitment and will is a lot of what's behind it. Now, certainly our efforts have gotten easier as we've moved into the electronic age, and we have more integrations with the other agencies across the state. But we always had the will, and we always believed in the value of the data and the information. And that's why, we have such a strong history of having data in Minnesota. All I can say.
Well, thank you. And is there any other comments from the panel at this point? I leave that open. All right. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. I'd like to thank our incredible speakers, Sara Andrews, Mark Bergstrom, and Kelly Mitchell. And I want to remind everyone who's with us and invite you to please join us next week for our panel, which is focused on sentencing review and reduction and next steps for the commission, which will have some incredible panelists as well. And we will be following up just for everybody who has joined us today with a recording of this session, so you can, again, listen to your favorite parts and your speakers many times over. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your time today. We look forward to seeing the future for the commission here.
Thank you.
Thank you.